Welcome to Divorces in North Carolina. Sandra Dinkins, Identification and Classification of Marital Assets and Debts. Do you know how marital assets and debts are identified and classified? Welcome to a world where understanding the dynamics of finances and relationships can be as important as love itself. We're here to delve into the fascinating and crucial topic of identifying and classifying marital assets and debts. This isn't just about who gets what, but rather, it's about fairness, clarity, and ensuring both parties in a marriage have a comprehensive understanding of their financial standing. From the house you live in, to the car you drive, even to the debt on your credit card, everything has its place in the grand scheme of marital finances. And it's not just about possession, it's about classification. Is it separate or marital property? The answers to these questions can greatly impact the financial outcome of a marriage. So stay tuned as we delve into the step-by-step process of identifying and classifying marital assets and debts. If you are getting value from this video, please subscribe. First things first, what are marital assets and debts exactly? Well, in the simplest terms, these are the financial obligations and possessions that a couple acquires during their marriage. This can include everything from the home they live in, the cars they drive, to the credit card bills they rack up. Now, it's important to understand that not all assets and debts are created equal in the eyes of the law. They're usually divided into two categories, separate and marital. Separate property refers to everything that one spouse owned before the marriage. This could be a car, a house, or even a hefty student loan. It also includes any assets acquired during the marriage through inheritance or gifts. So if your great-aunt leaves you a priceless painting in her will, that's considered your separate property. The same goes for any professional or business licenses that would cease to exist upon transfer. These are also classified as separate property, as is any increase in value to separate property and income derived from such property. On the flip side, marital property is everything that the couple acquires together during the marriage, up until the date of separation. This includes real estate, personal belongings, and yes, debts too. Even if one spouse took out the loan or bought the car, as long as it happened during the marriage, it's considered marital property. However, there are some gray areas. For instance, if marital funds were used to improve the value of separate property, some of that increased value might be considered marital. Similarly, if an asset increases in value due to the personal, managerial, or financial contribution of one or both spouses, that increase is considered marital. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. So, in a nutshell, the difference between separate and marital property lies in when and how it was acquired. It's a crucial distinction that can greatly affect how assets and debts are divided in a divorce. Understanding the difference between what's separate and what's marital is the first step in this process. Now, how do we identify these assets and debts? That's probably the question on your mind. Well, let's dive right into it. The identification of assets and debts is a critical first step in the process of marital asset and debt division. This process is primarily concerned with determining whether the husband, the wife, or the marital union itself has any claim to a particular asset or debt. Let's start with assets. Identification of an asset involves understanding the nature of the asset and when it was acquired. Was it before the marriage, during the marriage, or before the date of separation? For instance, if a house was purchased during the course of the marriage, it's considered a marital asset. On the other hand, if a spouse brought a house into the marriage, that house is generally considered separate property. Now, let's talk about debts. Just like assets, debts are identified based on when they were incurred. A student loan taken out before marriage, that's a separate debt. A credit card bill racked up during the marriage, that's a marital debt. But what happens when marital funds were used to improve the value of a separate property? Well, things can get a little tricky here. If, for example, a spouse used marital funds to renovate a house that they owned before the marriage, some of that increased value may be considered a marital asset. Similarly, if the value of a separate property increases due to the personal, managerial, or financial contribution of one or both spouses, that increase in value is also considered marital. Think of a business that one spouse owned before the marriage, but that grew significantly during the marriage because of the efforts of both spouses. That growth in value? It's a marital asset. One more thing to remember is that professional and business licenses, which would end upon transfer, are defined as separate property. Any increase in value to separate property and income derived from such property is also classified as separate. Now, it's important to note that these are general principles, and every situation is unique. The identification process is complex and requires careful consideration of many factors. It's not just about when an asset or debt was acquired or incurred, but also about how it was used, improved, or managed during the marriage. In conclusion, identifying marital assets and debts is a crucial step in determining the equitable distribution of these assets and debts in the event of a divorce. It's about figuring out who has a claim to what, and it sets the stage for the next step in the process, classification. Remember, identification is all about determining who has a claim to what. After identification comes classification. But what does that mean? Well, it's not as complicated as it may sound. Classification is the process where the court decides how to define the assets and debts, whether they are marital or separate property. This decision is based on statutes or laws in place, and it's a critical step in the process of asset and debt distribution in a marriage. Now you might be wondering, how does the court make this decision? The court looks at various factors, such as when the asset or debt was acquired. Was it before the marriage, during the marriage, or before the date of separation? The answers to these questions play a significant role in determining the nature of the asset or debt. Let's discuss this further. Separate property is all real and personal property and debt that was acquired before the marriage. But it's not just limited to that. It can also include property acquired during the marriage by devise, descent, bequest, or gift. These terms might sound a bit legalistic, but essentially, they refer to property or assets that have been inherited or received as a gift during the marriage. On the other hand, all real and personal property and debts acquired by either spouse during the marriage, before the date of separation, and still owned currently, are considered marital assets and debt. This means that both spouses have a claim to these assets and debts. Now, here's an interesting point to note. Generally, assets and debts acquired before the marriage are classified as separate property and are owned only by the spouse who acquired them. However, if marital funds were used to improve the value of the property, some of that value may be shared during equitable distribution. This is because the marital funds have contributed to the increase in value. Also, bear in mind that increases in value resulting from the personal, managerial, or financial contribution of one or both spouses is considered marital. This could include things like a home increasing in value because of renovations done by one or both spouses, or a business growing due to the efforts of one or both spouses. Furthermore, professional and business licenses, which would end on transfer, are defined to be separate property. This also applies to any increase in value to separate property and income derived from such property. So you can see that classification is not a one-size-fits-all process. It involves careful consideration of various factors, and each case can be unique. But it's an important step as it lays the groundwork for the next stages of the process. It determines how assets and debts will be divided and can significantly impact the outcome of a separation or divorce. Classification is a critical step that lays the groundwork for the next stages of the process. It's a complex yet essential part of understanding and dealing with marital assets and debts. So, you might be wondering, how does the court make these classifications? Well, it's all about the evidence and findings of fact during discovery. Now, what does that mean? In simple terms, it's the process of gathering information that supports or disputes the claims being made about the nature of an asset or debt. Imagine you're a detective in a thrilling mystery. The evidence is your clues, the pieces of the puzzle that help build a picture of the asset or debt in question. These could be documents such as bank statements, property deeds, or even emails and text messages that show when, how, and why an asset was acquired or a debt incurred. But gathering evidence is just the first step. The court then looks at these pieces of evidence and makes findings of fact. This is where the court determines what the evidence actually proves. For instance, Does a bank statement show that an asset was purchased during the marriage? Or does it show that it was bought before the marriage and hence is separate property? However, it's not as straightforward as it sounds. In some cases, an asset may have been acquired before the marriage, but marital funds may have been used to improve its value. This is where findings of fact come into play. The court will look at the evidence and determine what portion of the asset's value is marital and what portion is separate. Similarly, if an asset increased in value due to the personal, managerial, or financial contribution of one or both spouses during the marriage, that increase in value could be considered a marital asset. Again, it's the court's job to look at the evidence and make these determinations. And let's not forget about debts. The same principles apply. The court will examine the evidence to determine when the debt was incurred and who is responsible for it. So, evidence and findings of fact aren't just legal jargon. They are the tools used to unravel the mystery of marital assets and debts. And their role in classification is pivotal. As you can see, evidence plays a crucial role in the classification of assets and debts. Now that we have identified and classified, what's next? Let's dive into the impact of identification and classification on equitable distribution in a marriage. The process of identifying and classifying assets and debts is not just a bureaucratic exercise. It directly influences the outcome of equitable distribution. First, let's consider an asset acquired before the marriage. Let's say, a house. This is typically classified as separate property and is owned only by the spouse who acquired it. However, if marital funds were used to improve the value of this house, some of that value may be shared during equitable distribution. This is a perfect example of how the classification of an asset can impact its distribution. Secondly, consider the assets acquired during the marriage. These are generally classified as marital assets. So, if a couple purchases a car during their marriage, it is considered a marital asset. In the event of a divorce, the value of this car would be evenly distributed between the spouses. But what about debts? Just like assets, debts are also classified as either separate or marital. Debts incurred by either spouse during the marriage, before the date of separation, are considered marital debts. These would be equally distributed between the spouses during a divorce. Now, let's talk about increases in value. Any increase in value of a separate property due to the personal, managerial, or financial contribution of one or both spouses is considered marital. This means that if your separate property has increased in value because of your spouse's efforts, that increase is subject to equitable distribution. Lastly, professional and business licenses, which would end on transfer, are defined to be separate property. However, any increase in value to these licenses and income derived from such property is also subject to equitable distribution. So, as you can see, the process of identifying and classifying assets and debts directly influences the outcome of equitable distribution. It determines who gets what and how much in a divorce, making it an essential step in the process. The process of identifying and classifying assets and debts directly influences the outcome of equitable distribution. Let's recap what we've learned today. We've journeyed through the complex world of marital assets and debts, unearthing the definitions, the process of identification and classification, and the impact on equitable distribution. Marital assets and debts are crucial components of any marriage, representing real and personal property, as well as debts acquired by either spouse during the marital union before the date of separation. These assets and debts are not just physical items or financial obligations. They are the tangible reflection of a shared life. We've discovered that the identification process starts by determining whether the husband, the wife, or the marital union has a claim to the asset or debt. Was it acquired before the marriage, during the marriage, or before the date of separation? These questions are key to laying the groundwork for what comes next. Classification. Classification is a critical process, where the court decides how these assets and debts are defined by statute. Are they marital or separate property? This decision must be supported by evidence and findings of fact during discovery. Separate property is typically all real and personal property and debt acquired before marriage or property acquired during the marriage by devise, descent, bequest, or gift. We also touched on the concept of equitable distribution, the process that determines how these classified assets and debts are divided. Remember, assets and debts acquired before the marriage are classified as separate property and owned solely by the spouse who acquired them. However, if marital funds were used to improve the value of the property, some of that value may be shared during equitable distribution. Keep in mind, increases in value resulting from the personal, managerial, or financial contribution of one or both spouses is marital. Professional and business licenses that would end on transfer are defined to be separate property, as is any increase in value to separate property and income derived from such property. Remember, understanding this process is vital for anyone navigating property and debt division in a marriage.